record our sermons on video. We have our camera going, and I heard a little beep there, so I think maybe it is working. I appreciate Dave pushing the button for us. We will see later on how well that works, and we'll give you information about how to access these recorded sermons. It will be through our website. When we get them loaded in there properly, you'll be able to access a link that will take you to the place where the videos are. This afternoon, we'd like to indulge a little bit more of your attention as we cover some more ideas from the book of Ruth. We've been studying this series, looking at a book of the Bible each Sunday, up through as many as we can get to this year. We started off with Genesis, and we've worked our way up to the book of Ruth. And last week we started looking at the book of Ruth as a place where we find a lot about relationships. And so the title of our lesson became Relationships in Ruth. Remember that what we talked about is a time period that's taking place back when the judges ruled the earth, or at least Israel. When judges were there, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us that this was in the days when the judges ruled. So we're looking at a time very early in the history of the Israelites. From Judges chapter 21 and verse 25, we also note that this was a time when there was much immorality, much idolatry, much warfare going on in Israel. And the explanation is given for it there in Judges 21 verse 25. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we see a little bit of a gap here in authority perhaps. But as we began to look further, we noticed that there were many relationships spelled out among the characters of this book. We won't spend that much time on them right now because we did talk about them last week, but remember that overall is these people's relationship to God. So we're showing God at the top of the chart there. But we had a man named Elimelech, who was married to Naomi. And this was taking place in the area of Israel called Judah. And the marriage there produced two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. These two sons also, of course, were related to Naomi. They were her children too. As time passed there in the land of Judah, there was a famine that occurred. A great famine occurred across the whole land of Judah and probably the surrounding areas too. And especially in Judah, there was just a really severe famine, no food, lack of food, and no economics to look at, no jobs or anything. And so Elimelech and Naomi and their sons moved to the area called Moab. Moab over on the eastern side of the Jordan, up on the Transjordanian plateau. Somehow that area had escaped the worst of the famine, and they were able to go there, and it was probably a wise move. There was work there, perhaps. I don't know what line of work Elimelech was in, but they found work to do. While they were there, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi with her two sons. Her two sons found wives among the women of Moab. Both Ruth and her friend Orpah were Moabites. They were not Israelites. They were from the tribe of Moab, which was a different line than the Israelites. But because they married her sons, they each also had a relationship to Naomi. They became her daughters-in-law. Down the road a little ways, we're not sure how long, but there was more death in the family. The two sons of Naomi passed away. Mahlon and Chilion died, leaving only Naomi and her daughters-in-law to survive. As time passed, the famine eased in Judah, and Naomi and her daughters-in-law resolved to move back to Judah. At least Naomi did. And that meant that the arrow would switch and they would move from Moab back to Israel, because Naomi knew that there was family there and they had some connections that maybe could help them survive. Well, as they made preparations to leave, Naomi gave the daughters-in-law a choice. She said to them, if you'd rather stay in Moab, then please do. If you'd rather move with me to Judah, then that's up to you. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, chose to stay in Moab, and that's the last we hear about her. But Ruth goes to Israel with Naomi, and there she forms a relationship with a kinsman called Boaz. And that's going to be the center focus of our story as we get later into it. But you might recall some of those relationships that we talked about last week. Since Ruth eventually marries Boaz, then she also, or Naomi also forms a relationship with Boaz. But all of these are important relationships because they illustrate for us what the culture was like back then. They illustrate for us how people, even as they do now, move around because of economic conditions and so on. When we look at the book of Ruth all together, the whole picture, we see that there's a couple of things that are formatted here. One is that the book of Ruth really illustrates how Jehovah God rewards those who make wise spiritual choices and who show steadfast family loyalty. Here in this story, we're going to see how Ruth forms a very strong loyalty to Naomi and her family. Even though they weren't blood relatives, she formed a very strong and lasting relationship. And they also made wise spiritual choices. Excuse me. When Ruth and Naomi moved back to the land of Judah, they had a number of different choices they could have made about how to make a living there and how to set up their family and all. But they chose things that were in keeping with God's commands, and that made it better for them. The other purpose in the book of Ruth is one that's very interesting to me. It explains how Ruth, a Moabitess, became an ancestor of King David, and then further down, the Messiah, Jesus. You sometimes think that someone like King David would have had a bloodline that was purely Judah and nothing else, but not so. Moabitess, the name of Ruth, appears as his ancestor. And Jesus, you would think Jesus would have an ancestry that was purely Judah, the kingly tribe, but it wasn't. We find that a couple of oddities occur. Rahab, the harlot from Jericho, is in the lineage of Jesus, along with Ruth here, this Moabitess. And so we'll read about that when we get to it. We also note that in Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus, as it's given there, mentions Ruth as one of his ancestors. So, we've seen that. We talked about that last week, and that gives us some background for the book itself. Let's talk about some choices that were made. In the first chapter of Ruth, we saw that Ruth made a choice to stay with Naomi. And we're not going to go through it in all that much detail, except to remember the points that she made. This comes from Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 16. And here's what Ruth said as Naomi was giving her the choice about whether to stay in Moab or to come on back to Judah with her. Ruth chose to, number one, go wherever Naomi goes. Number two, to live wherever Naomi lives. Number three, to make the people of Naomi her people. Number four, to make the God of Naomi her God. That's important there. Concentrate on that. She also promised that she would die and be buried where Naomi is buried, looking far ahead. And then, number six, to let nothing but death come between them. We noted how this particular passage is often used in wedding ceremonies where spouses will say these words to each other, and that's not really the intent of it here. This was the intent of daughter-in-law to stay with her mother-in-law throughout all of the rest of their lives. In essence, what happened when Ruth made all these promises, she was becoming, or had become, a proselyte to Judaism. She took on Naomi's God. She took on Naomi's people and her customs and her culture and the way that she lived. Later on, we start looking at how important making choices is. And some of the choices that we see being made are important ones. We know ourselves that choices usually come with consequences, sometimes good ones and sometimes bad ones. But we have to live with those consequences, and we should be thinking ahead as we make choices to be sure that we're making choices that will not have such awful consequences for us. For example, Elimelech and his sons made choices. They made the choice to move to Moab, which might have been a good business decision, but ultimately it left Naomi a widow and childless and dependent upon her daughters-in-law for survival. We also noted that Ruth made a choice. She made a choice to leave her family and her false religion. Now, remember what the Moabites were like. They were idolatrous people. And Ruth grew up in that culture, so she was a pagan. She was idolatrous. But she chose to leave her family and false religion for the true God and his family. When Paul writes to the Thessalonian Christians in 1 Thessalonians, the first chapter, let's just go back and reread that, because last week we noted that Paul tells those Thessalonian Christians that they had done very much the same thing when they became Christians. And get back to it there from chapter 1, starting in verse 7. And Paul writes to those Christians there, so that you became examples to all in Macedonia and Achaia who believed. For from you the word of the Lord has sounded forth, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith toward God has gone out, so that we do not need to say anything. For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. This is an important factor in the decision that Ruth made. She turned away from her family and God's and turned to worship the true God. If you go on down to verse 10, Paul includes this, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. This applies to you and me today. We're not leaving our country for another one, but we are expected to follow Jesus and make the choice to follow him and leave our gods and our attachments behind. Sort of a similar situation. This was also a decision that Ruth made, which would have both temporal and eternal blessings. Back in Mark chapter 10, Jesus explained to his disciples that any of them who left houses and lands and father and mother and brother and sister and even wives in this life would be replaced. They would have replenishment of those things they left behind, as well as eternal reward. So Ruth sort of shows us a pattern of that kind of choice making. So we get to tonight's, or this afternoon's beginning place, actually, and we find Ruth and Naomi in Judah. And if we turn to chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, we find an interesting cultural development here. Ruth takes up the job of being a gleaner. You ever wanted to become a gleaner? What is a gleaner anyway? Well, Ruth tells us what one is here. Let's go back to chapter 2, and the first 3 verses tell us there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So here we're introduced to Boaz, who is a kinsman of some sort of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, which was of the family of Elimelech. All right, gleaners were those who came along after the main part of the crop had been harvested, and they gathered up the scraps, pretty much. Now, it wasn't just little scraps. There could be a good living made off of gleaning, and Ruth was able to do that. As she gathered the leftovers from where the harvesters had been, it was enough to sustain a family, and that's what Ruth was doing. It had been provided by the law of Moses. Very quickly, let's take a quick look there at the book of Leviticus, beginning in chapter 19, verse 9. Here's God's law to his people. "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." This was something God put in place for them to leave some of the crop in the field for the benefit of those who were in need. Turn over to Deuteronomy And as Moses repeats these essential parts of God's law before the people take the promised land, in verse 19 he tells them this: when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. So God was setting up this pattern here of gleaning as a way to take care of those who had needs in the land of Judah. And Ruth was simply taking that opportunity. Was that just a chance opportunity? I don't think so. As we read more in the book of Ruth, what we really find out is that this is some of God's providence. This is a way of ensuring that she, Ruth, and her family would continue to survive in Judah and eventually, like we said, become the ancestor of King David and later on Jesus the Christ. So it's more likely that providence is at work here. We also see a few more relationships, very, very simple ones. There was the relationship between Boaz and his workers. Well, that's interesting. Right now, in our country, we're seeing a lot of friction between workers and their bosses. You know, there's a big strike going on in the car industry. I learned, I think a day or two ago, that there's a big teacher strike about to happen in Chicago. So, you know, workers and their bosses are having some problems getting along, but not so with Boaz. In the second chapter, at verse 4, now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And he was referring to Ruth. So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Well, okay. So they had a good relationship. There was respect between Boaz and his workers, enough so that he gained some information about this Moabite woman who was gleaning his field. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. So his servant gives him a little insight to Ruth. She's industrious. She's a worker. She's out there trying to provide for her family. So that's a pretty interesting relationship. There's also, of course, the relationship between Ruth and Boaz, the two of them. This shows kindness. Boaz was a businessman. He owned the field. It was his grain. He could easily have said to his workers, you keep those gleaners out. I want to make as much money as possible from the crop that I'm harvesting here. But beginning in verse 8, Boaz says to Ruth, he approaches this young woman who's gleaning his field, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you would take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and you come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. Boaz goes on and tells her, come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she sat and ate and was satisfied, and kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. and leave it that she may glean and do not rebuke her. Well, look at that. A little bit of extra help. He's being very kind to this young girl. Says you can drink the water that the young men draw. You can eat from their food. When they are working in the field, don't be afraid to slip in there and grab some of the grain they've let fall. And he even says to the workers, let some of the grain fall on purpose so she can have it. So there's an example of overreaching kindness in the part of Boaz, and it forms a relationship that we'll see in a moment turns out successful. Of course, there's also the relationship between Boaz and Naomi. Taking just a quick look at chapter 2 and verse 20, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be the Lord, who has not forgotten his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man, she's speaking about Boaz, is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. So, there's another relationship. And that was important in those days because relationships in the family were what held groups together, and they benefited from that. So, we continue. When we talk about the book of Ruth, we also talk about character. There are some good characters in this book. We've already mentioned Ruth as an industrious and loyal servant to her mother-in-law, and Boaz being a good and kind boss to his employees and to this young lady who came to be in his care. But there's more to it as well. Ruth shows a tremendous amount of humility and willingness to minister to the needs of her mother-in-law. Remember when they first began to come back to the land of Judah after leaving Moab, Ruth stayed with her, told her, I'll go where you go, I'll live where you live, I'll take care of your needs as long as we both shall live. So she took care of those needs. Boaz, like we just said, showed tremendous kindness and a sense of propriety, doing what was right, even going overboard to be a righteous individual in his treatment of this foreign woman in his field. By the way, remember that for generations, the Israelites and the Moabites had been enemies. They fought against each other. Moab was always on the outskirts trying to break into Israel, trying to cause harm, and this was unusual for him to be that kind to a Moabite lady. Ruth's good reputation also preceded her. This is outstanding to me. She didn't come into the land of Judah as a sneaking in type thing. She came in, anybody could tell what she was up to. She was doing her best to be successful in keeping the family together. Her good reputation preceded her. And look at, we just read there earlier from chapter 2 about verse 10 through 12. And when she and Boaz are making this conversation, remember verse 11 told us, Boaz answered and said, it has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. Boaz knew about all she had been doing. If she had been underhanded or some kind of a criminal or someone in it just to take advantage of somebody, he would have known about it. But her good reputation went ahead of her, and that's what Jesus tells us to be like. In Matthew 5, where Brother David read for our scripture reading, Jesus tells us there, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. We're to be examples just like Ruth was, that our reputation would be without reproach. Somebody who sees our actions would know that they're actions that you can count on as being worthy. Also in the Philippian letter, Philippians chapter 2, when Paul writes to the Christians there, he explains to them how important it is to be the right kind of example wherever you are. Take a look at verse 14 there from chapter 2. And he says, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Paul tells the Christians there, like he tells you and me, to be shining lights in the generation where we live. Though it may be crooked and perverse, we can shine forth, holding on to the Word of God. And Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 5, gives us much the same information. He says there, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to the elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and clothed with humility. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Well, Ruth's reputation was based in some degree upon her reliance upon God, the God of Naomi, whom Naomi had probably told her, God will take care of us. And so Ruth was simply acting in a way that shows her understanding of that. Naomi had a plan. And as we begin to wind our study down a little bit this afternoon, chapter 3 tells us about some providential circumstances that occur as Naomi has a plan for her daughter-in-law to begin making her own way. Chapter 3, first 4 verses tell us about this. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, Daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself and put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he is finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Well, I'm catching on here to some strange custom, aren't you? This custom of uncovering the feet? Where did that come from? I don't know, but that's what Naomi suggested, that Ruth do nothing untoward, but just to kind of ease into where this fellow is sleeping and uncover his feet and lie down there. That was her plan. Providence? Yeah, Naomi had some knowledge here that she shared with Ruth about where Boaz was going to be and probably what he'd be doing, and gave her the insight into this local custom. So, nothing indecent happened. We're not saying here that Ruth was taken advantage of or that she took advantage of anybody. Nothing like you'd see on modern TV shows today. No, this was perfectly upright. But verses 7 and 8 tell us this in chapter 3. After Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was cheerful. He went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain, and she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. This one kind of makes me laugh a little bit. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Well, that's a little bit strange, isn't it? You'd think a guy would be startled to look down and see some young lady curled up at his feet. Wow. Now young ladies, take a thought here. Is this something that might work for you? I don't know. We're not in the same culture, are we? But at any rate, verses 7 and 8 tell us that. Verse 11 tells us that nothing untoward took place. Boaz says, And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. He's saying, I'll make sure they understand that you didn't do anything that was unbecoming of an upright young lady. So Ruth's reputation was intact. Boaz had the character and integrity to make success likely. Naomi was able to kind of pick this out. She knew what kind of man Boaz was. Verse 18 of chapter 3 says, Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man, that's Boaz, will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. Boaz was part of the plan now too, and he's going to take care of it without delay. All right? Naomi's plan is working. Success occurs in chapter 4, where Boaz does what's called redemption. Now, when Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, he left behind some assets in the land of Judah, some land that would have been Naomi's, except the sons were dead too, and she didn't have any direct link to the property that was left. So another near kinsman was in line to get it. He just had to redeem it or pay up a price to the village elders to get that property in his name. But he wasn't able to. And chapter 4 tells us how Boaz worked out a deal with him where he would redeem Naomi and Ruth and the property that was theirs, and it would become his. And there's an interesting other cultural custom that I ran across here. It's the custom of handing your sandal to somebody in order to seal the deal. Now I find that really interesting. It's kind of like if you went to buy a car today and you decided on the one you wanted and you liked the deal, you whip out your sandal and hand it to the salesman and the deal is struck, right? Well, it was kind of like that. Boaz, it said, made the deal with his kinsman to redeem Naomi and Ruth. In chapter 4, go back up to verses 9 and 10, Boaz said to the elders and all the people, back up a little bit. Where are we here? Verse 7 and 8. Yeah. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal. All right. And then verses 9 and 10 tell us that Boaz declares that the deal is done. He says to the elders and all the people, you're witnesses this day, that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, he says, now here's the real success, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren, and from his position at the